This video will help you understand if you're considered an eligible designated beneficiary when inheriting retirement accounts, and if so, how to treat required minimum distributions. If you don't know who I am, my name is Chris Dime. I'm a certified financial planner out of Edmonds, Washington, and I specialize in working with folks to and through retirement. As my clients get older, it's not uncommon that they're going to start inheriting funds from the next generation or other loved ones who pass on. And most often, these funds come by way of retirement account inheritances. These would be things like inherited 401ks, IRAs, etc. Non-retirement accounts that pass on to the next generation have their own set of rules, so we're going to put those on the shelf for now and solely talk about retirement accounts that get inherited. After the passing of the first Secure Act in 2019, the IRS broke up beneficiaries of retirement accounts into three distinct categories: eligible designated beneficiaries, non-eligible designated beneficiaries, and then lastly, non-designated beneficiaries. Each category of beneficiary has their own unique set of circumstances and ways to title the account, and furthermore, how to treat required minimum distributions. So in today's video, we'll find out if you're classified as an eligible designated beneficiary, and if so, how to treat required minimum distributions. So let's jump in. As a quick refresher on required minimum distributions, these are those mandatory amounts of money that must come out of a retirement account once you're in your 70s. In addition, even if you're not in your 70s, but you inherit a retirement account, you will have your own required minimum distribution schedule of some kind levied on the account. And that's regardless of which type of beneficiary designation you are. But to keep it simple, if you are an eligible designated beneficiary, you're going to fall into one of these five categories of individuals. You're either going to be a spouse of the decedent, you're going to be a beneficiary that's not more than 10 years younger than the decedent, you're going to be the minor child of the decedent, you're going to be an individual with disabilities, or you're going to be an individual who's considered chronically ill. So from a high level, those are the categories, and most of them are fairly self-explanatory, but there's a few that require a bit more nuance, so let's jump into that. First up, the minor child. This is explicitly not grandchildren, nieces, nephews, whatever. It's children of the decedent. And minor is defined as age 21 by the IRS for the purposes of this definition. And you can still be considered a minor if you're attending school all the way up into age 26. Now, someone with disabilities is a bit more of a murky definition because based on the institution, whether it's government, civilian, or insurance company, you might be defined as someone with disabilities in one situation, but not in another. For the purposes of how the IRS defines an individual with disabilities relative to being an eligible designated beneficiary, that individual must be unable to engage in any substantial gainful activity as a result of some type of physical or mental impairment. And that impairment must be expected to result in either a premature death or for that individual to maintain that disability for a very long duration. Lastly, you must be able to provide some form of proof of your disability, which is usually the certification by some type of physician or medical practitioner. The last interesting definition is someone who's chronically ill. The IRS keeps this one fairly simple though by simply defaulting to how they also define somebody who is in need of long-term care. So they say a chronically ill individual is someone that suffers to perform at least 2 activities of daily living or requires significant help with completing those activities. And the inability to perform them must be due to some severe cognitive impairment. Okay, so let's fast forward and say you are considered one of those 5 categories of eligible designated beneficiaries. And now the investment custodian is calling you saying, hey, you're listed as beneficiary on this account. What do you want to do with the money? To find out what your options are, you'll also need to determine whether the decedent passed away before or if they passed away on or after what's called their required beginning date, which is the year in which they were supposed to start taking required minimum distributions. Now, it's not as simple as looking at a past investment statement of this account and identifying whether required minimum distributions were taken out or not to figure this out. So it's quite plausible that an individual might be on their required beginning date, pass away, you not notice any RMDs come out of that account, but technically they'd still be considered passing away on their required beginning date. You can easily confirm whether somebody passed away on or before their required beginning date by grabbing their date of birth as well as their date of death and looking online as a verification. I'll link below to some resources where it's pretty easy plug and play. Okay, so let's fast forward again and say you've identified that you are an eligible designated beneficiary. You've determined whether or not the individual passed away on or after or before their required beginning date. Now let's look into your options. Now I'm grabbing this information straight from the IRS's website, so if things change, you might want to check out the link I'll put down below. for any updates that change to policies. But for now, as of 2023, here are the rules. Let's start with spouses because they have the most optionality as it comes to all the eligible designated beneficiaries. So first up, spouses. If the spouse inherits funds before the decedent met their required beginning date, then the spouse has a number of different options. Number one, they can keep the inherited account as it is and not take out required minimum distributions until that individual was going to meet their required beginning date. Then they'd have to start taking out required minimum distributions. They can leave the account titled as an inherited account and then start immediately taking out required minimum distributions based on their own life expectancy. This strategy is called a stretch IRA because the beneficiary is stretching out required minimum distributions, oftentimes before they'd actually need to start taking out required minimum distributions, but they're stretching out taking the distributions out over their lifetime. They're stretching out the IRA. The third option they have is to follow what's called the 10-year rule. And the 10-year rule is defined as saying by the 10th year after the year of death, then the entire retirement account must be fully liquidated. That's what the 10-year rule says. In addition, the 10-year rule says if you inherit these funds before the decedent met their required beginning date, then you will have no required minimum distribution in years 1 through 9. But in year 10, you got to liquidate the whole account. Now, if the 10-year rule is ever elected after the required beginning date, then the beneficiary must take out a required minimum distribution in years 1 through 9 and then fully liquidate the account in year 10. One quick side note on the 10-year rule. Some folks might be asking, why would anybody elect the 10-year rule over taking lifetime stretch IRA distributions? And most of the time, they wouldn't elect the 10-year rule. However, sometimes it might make sense, and you can think of a unique situation where it might be in your best interest to avoid taking out anything from this account in years 1 through 9. We'll say that those are super high income tax years maybe, but in maybe that 10th year, you're anticipating little or no income at all, and then you'd liquidate fully the retirement account rather than taking out a distribution every year in years 1 through 9 and then continuing to take out required minimum distributions. There's some situation I can think of where it might make sense, but most of the time, it'll make more sense to take the stretch IRA over electing 10-year rule treatment. The last option that spouses have, which is unique to spouses, is they're allowed to roll these inherited funds into their own personal IRA and treat it just as if it was their own account, which means they wouldn't need to start taking out required minimum distributions until they reach their own required beginning date. Now let's say they inherited these funds after the decedent met their required beginning date. The spouse has two options. They can keep the inherited retirement account titled as an inherited account and then begin the stretch IRA process where they stretch out required minimum distributions over their own life expectancy, or they're allowed to roll this IRA into their own personal IRA, just as we talked about a second ago. Now, for non-spouses who are considered eligible designated beneficiaries, they have far less options, and so we'll keep it simple. If the decedent passes away before their required beginning date, then the beneficiary must use a stretch IRA strategy, and they would pick either their life expectancy or the decedent's life expectancy to take out those required minimum distributions, whichever distribution schedule is longer. So said another way, whoever's younger, the decedent or the beneficiary, you'd pick their life expectancy tables to run required minimum distributions off of, because that would result in the smallest required minimum distribution every year. Now, if they inherit these funds after the decedent met their required beginning date, then the beneficiary must distribute these assets over the beneficiary's life expectancy. One caveat for these folks, however, is if it's the minor who inherits these funds. Minors who inherit funds will have to take out required minimum distributions every year until they reach the age of majority. Then after they meet the age of majority, then the 10-year rule will apply. Now, there's some confusion as to how folks are interpreting the IRS's guidance here. The confusion lies with how to treat that 10-year rule. So let's say the minor inherits funds, they're taking out required minimum distributions every year until they reach the age of majority, we'll just say 21 in this case. Now they have to follow the 10-year rule. So now the confusion lies in those 10 years, does the beneficiary need to take out required minimum distributions in years 1 through 9 and then fully liquidate in year 10? Or are they allowed to have been taking required minimum distributions, reach the age of majority, not take out required minimum distributions in years 1 through 9, and then fully liquidate in year 10? There's some debate online, so I would recommend if you are in this situation, hire a tax professional to help you interpret guidance here. But if you are going to insist on doing it yourself, the safe play is to take out a required minimum distribution in years 1 through 9, and then fully liquidate in year 10. What that looks like logistically is the minor takes required minimum distributions till they reach the age of majority, then they continue to do so in years 1 through 9, and then they fully liquidate in year 10. This is a safer play than not taking out required minimum distributions, because if you were supposed to have been taking out RMDs in years 1 through 9 and you didn't, you're going to owe a ton in tax penalties. So hopefully there's some clarity relative to IRS guidance on this as we march along in the years. One last type of retirement account you might inherit is a Roth IRA. As you might know, Roth IRAs do not have required minimum distributions, nor do Roth 401ks anymore as of last year. So the IRS treats any Roth IRA when it's inherited as being considered received before an individual met their required beginning date. So even if the decedent passed away in their 90s, if you inherit a Roth IRA, it's considered being passed to you before the required beginning date, which means all the aforementioned options and choices and RMD treatments apply. So as we wrap up, I would say for the most part, if you're unsure exactly how to treat required minimum distributions from an inherited account, seek the guidance of a professional, because the last thing you want to do is not take out a required minimum distribution when you were supposed to. So hopefully that was helpful in clarifying whether or not you're classified as an eligible designated beneficiary. We covered some of the options you have, and then lastly, we covered how to treat required minimum distributions. If you have further questions, drop me in the chat below or get in touch on the website. We'll get you squared away. Have an awesome rest of the week. We'll chat with you later. Bye.